We pop vitamins, we take a pill for a headache, we grab that over-the-counter cough syrup. But I bet most of us don't really think about how we know those things are safe. Or even if they actually do what they say, right?
Well, there's this whole system working behind the scenes. It's kind of fascinating, actually. And it's called good manufacturing practices, GMPs for short.
Yeah, MPs, yeah. And they're all about ensuring the quality and effectiveness of, well, all sorts of health-related products.
Absolutely.
But for this deep dive, we're going to zoom in. We're focusing on how these practices apply to clinical research. We're talking about good clinical practices or cGCPs.
Okay, so cGCPs. These are the rules of the game when it comes to testing new treatments on people. It's all about making sure that research is done ethically, safely, and in a way that produces reliable scientific data.
And the thing is, understanding how cGCPs came to be, well, it isn't just a boring history lesson.
Right.
It's really about understanding why we have the regulations we have today. And it helps us see the evolution of ethical thinking and scientific rigor.
Absolutely. These aren't just random rules that someone dreamed up overnight. There's a whole backstory here, a journey of learning and adapting based on experience, scientific advancements, and yeah, sometimes even mistakes and tragedies.
Exactly. So for this deep dive, we've dug into a bunch of sources. We're looking at regulations laid out in the Code of Federal Regulations, Title 21, which covers food and drugs. We've got like 21 CFR Part 110 for manufacturing practices for food, and then Part 111 for dietary supplements. And of course, Part 211 lays out all those rules for pharmaceuticals. And then there's the part we're focusing on, Part 312, which is all about the conduct of clinical trials themselves.
Right, and then there's Part 314, which deals with new drug applications.
Oh, yeah, that whole approval process.
Yeah.
And we've also looked into discussions around good documentation practices and laboratory procedures.
Yeah, because it's all connected. The quality of the data, the integrity of the research, it all depends on good practices across the board.
So basically, our mission is to trace how these cGCP standards developed. We'll go back to those early days when ethical considerations were just starting to take shape, and we'll track how those ideas evolved into the comprehensive regulatory framework we have today.
Right. It's a fascinating story. It's about progress, but it's also about learning from mistakes, from things that maybe didn't go so well in the past.
It's kind of like, where do we even start with the history of ethics in clinical research? Like, it didn't just suddenly appear one day.
Well, you're absolutely right. I mean, even before we had those formal regulations like, 21 CFR Part 312, which, by the way, governs how clinical investigations are conducted, including that whole process of getting permission to even start a clinical trial, the investigational new drug application process, even before all that, there was a growing recognition that, hey, we can't just experiment on people without some ethical boundaries. You know
Right.
what I mean?
Yeah, it's like a sense of moral responsibility that was starting to emerge, even without all the legal structures we have now.
Exactly. In those early days, the focus was less on having specific legal frameworks and more on some core principles, like informed consent, for example. Now, informed consent's a big deal today. It's a cornerstone of ethical research. But, the basic idea behind it, that people should willingly agree to participate in research and understand what they're getting into, that goes way back.
Right, like you should know the risks, the potential benefits, all of that.
Absolutely. And that's fundamental. But as science progressed, as we learned more, clinical trials, they became a lot more complicated. We started to see that, wow, these new treatments, they could have significant benefits. But there was also the potential for serious harm if things weren't done carefully.
Right, so that probably pushed things along, right? Like, okay, we need some clearer rules here. We need some oversight.
Absolutely. As research moved from simple observations to more controlled studies, there was this growing need to standardize how things were done. Everyone needed to be on the same page about how to collect data, how to analyze it, so that the findings would be reliable and, most importantly, not biased.
Yeah, because if the data is no good, then the whole thing falls apart.
Totally. And, as the pharmaceutical industry grew, with all these new medicines being developed and hitting the market, well, there were some significant events that really pushed for change. The Thalidomide Tragedy, for example, that was a huge wake-up call. It showed just how devastating the consequences could be when safety isn't the top priority.
The thalidomide situation, that was in the late 1950s and early 60s, right? It was a drug prescribed to pregnant women for morning sickness. But it ended up causing severe birth defects in thousands of babies.
Exactly. It was a global tragedy, and it really highlighted the absolute necessity for rigorous testing. And I mean, testing beyond just animal studies. We needed comprehensive clinical trials in humans before a drug could be widely available.
Yeah, because what works in animals doesn't always work the same way in people. So after thalidomide, it wasn't just about having rules. It was about, like, having the power to enforce those rules.
Right. That's a crucial point. So in the U.S., we had these amendments to the Food, Drug, and Cosmetic Act, the Kefauver-Harris Amendments of 1962. And these amendments, they were a direct response to the thalidomide crisis. They mandated that drug companies had to prove not only that their drugs were safe, but also that they actually worked. They had to be effective.
Okay, so before these amendments, it was mostly about safety, but now efficacy is front and center.
You got it. It was a major shift in the whole mindset of drug development. Suddenly, you couldn't just say, hey, our drug doesn't seem to hurt anyone. You had to show, with solid evidence, that it actually did what it was supposed to do.
And that meant changing how clinical trials were designed, right?
Absolutely. Things like using control groups, having statistically significant results, these became essential to proving efficacy. It wasn't enough to just have a few anecdotal reports anymore.
So after those major turning points, we start seeing a much more formal structure for good clinical practices emerging, right? Like actual guidelines and stuff.
Right. The latter half of the 20th century was really when people started to get serious about standardizing how clinical trials were run. You know, everything from how they were designed and conducted to how the data was monitored, audited, recorded, analyzed, and reported. The whole point was to make sure that the rights, safety, and well-being of the people participating in these trials were protected, and that the data itself, that it was reliable, that you could trust it.
And that led to national and international guidelines on good clinical practice. And these guidelines are still evolving.
Absolutely, they have to. Science doesn't stand still, and the challenges in clinical research, they're constantly changing. You see this reflected in how those regulations in 21 CFR Part 312 have been amended over the years. New scientific approaches, unexpected issues, all of that has shaped those rules.
And one of the things we see emphasized a lot in the regulations is the responsibility of the clinical investigator, the person leading the trial.
Yeah, they're the ones on the front lines, so to speak. And especially when it comes to inspections by regulatory bodies like the FDA, that investigator, they're in the spotlight.
It's kind of a big deal. And that FDA Form 1572, the Statement of Investigator, that's where the investigator formally commits to following the study plan, getting informed consent from participants, and keeping those records accurate and complete.
It's not just a formality, that's for sure. It really emphasizes this core idea of good clinical practice. It's all about personal responsibility. It's not enough to just have regulations. The people running the trials, they have to be the ones making sure those ethical principles are being upheld in practice.
And it's not just about what happens during the trial itself. There's all that preparation beforehand.
Oh, for sure. Before a clinical trial can even start, there's preclinical testing. You have to make sure the drug or treatment is safe enough to even try in humans. You test it in the lab, you test it in animals, and of course you have to be sure that the actual drug or treatment itself, that it's high quality.
Right, because if the drug's no good to begin with, the trial's meaningless.
Totally. And that's where those GMPs we talked about earlier, those good manufacturing practices, they come into play big time. The quality of the investigational product, the drug substance, the final formulation, it's got to be well characterized. It's got to be manufactured according to those GMP standards. Because if it isn't, well, the results of the clinical trial, they could be all messed up. And even worse, people participating in the trial could be exposed to unnecessary risks.
Right, so it's safety first.
Yeah.
Always. And documentation is key too, right? From the very beginning to the very end of the trial, every single thing needs to be recorded meticulously.
Yeah, and those good documentation practices, they're super important. It's not just about scribbling notes on a napkin. There are specific principles that guide how trial data needs to be recorded and kept safe.
ALCOBs+, that's the one we hear a lot. Attributable, legible, contemporaneous, original, accurate, complete, consistent, enduring, and available. That's a mouthful. But it basically means your documentation has to tick all those boxes to be considered reliable.
And if it doesn't, well, it can throw the whole trial into question, because in both GMP and GCP environments, the golden rule is, if it isn't documented, it didn't happen. It's all about having that clear, auditable record of everything that happened, so regulators can review it, and so we can be confident in the findings.
And speaking of regulators,
Yeah.
they don't just take your word for it, right? The FDA has this bioresearch monitoring program. They actually go out and inspect clinical trial sites to make sure everything's on the up and up.
Yeah, those inspections are serious business. They're there to check if the study's being run according to the approved plan, if it's following all the regulations. It's all about protecting the people in the trial and making sure the data's good.
So it's like looking back at this whole history of cGCPs. It's obvious those standards exist for a reason. They're the result of lessons learned, sometimes the hard way. And it's all about protecting people and making sure that the research we do leads to safe and effective treatments.
Exactly. From those early kind of basic ethical considerations to the formal regulations and the systems we have today for oversight, it's been a long journey, and it's not over yet.
So for our listeners, this all means that when you hear about a new drug getting approved, or if you're thinking about joining a clinical trial, you can be sure that there's this whole history behind those standards. They're not just arbitrary rules. They're there to protect you.
And they're always evolving. And that brings up an interesting question looking ahead. You know, clinical trials are getting more and more complex. We're moving into an era of personalized medicine, tailoring treatments to individuals, and science is advancing so rapidly. So the big question is, how will those cGCPs keep up? How will they adapt to these new challenges?
That's a good point. Personalized medicine, that throws a wrench in the works, doesn't it? Like,
Yeah.
how do you regulate something that's so individual? It seems like the regulations have to be strict enough for safety, but also flexible enough to handle these new innovative approaches.
Right, because we can't let regulations stifle progress. We need to find that balance.
It's definitely something to think about. So for everyone listening, we hope you'll take away a new appreciation for the work that goes into making sure the treatments we rely on are safe and effective. It's a fascinating world behind the scenes full of history, challenges, and a constant drive to do better.
Absolutely. And it's all about protecting people. That's the bottom line.
So the next time you take that vitamin or that pill, think about all those processes, all those people working to make sure it's safe and does what it's supposed to. It's a pretty incredible system when you stop and think about it.
It really is.
And that's it for this deep dive. Thanks for listening.
Thanks, everyone.